My beloved child, stop scrolling for just a moment, because what you are about to hear was not meant to pass before your eyes unnoticed. There is something waiting beneath the surface of a story you thought you already understood, something quietly hidden behind old words, unfinished conversations, and a chapter from your soulmate's past that may not be as simple as it once appeared. Stay here. Do not rush away. This is not a message of fear, and it is not a message asking you to judge anyone. It is a message about clarity, about the way truth eventually rises when the heart is finally strong enough to see it. And tonight, in this fictional spiritual story, heaven is drawing your attention toward one detail that changes the meaning of everything that came before it. There was a time when your soulmate believed the past had been completely closed. They told themselves that what happened before you belonged to another season, another version of themselves, another life almost. They tried to carry forward only the lessons and leave the confusion behind. But some chapters do not end simply because two people stop speaking. Sometimes an old chapter leaves behind questions. Sometimes it leaves behind assumptions. And sometimes, my child, it leaves behind one truth that was never spoken clearly enough. That is where this story begins, because someone connected to your soulmate's past has been hoping that one particular detail would remain buried beneath silence. Not because it is dangerous. Not because something terrible is coming. But because if you understood what truly happened, you might finally understand why your soulmate looks at you the way they do now. Pause here and listen closely, because the first revelation is smaller than what is coming later, yet it opens the door to everything. Your soulmate's ex once believed they understood exactly what your soulmate needed. They believed they knew how your soulmate would react, what they would tolerate, what they would forgive, and what they would always return to. Familiarity created confidence. Confidence slowly became assumption. And somewhere along the way, that assumption became the biggest mistake in the entire story. Your soulmate changed. Quietly. Deeply. Long before anyone around them realized it. There came a point when the things they once accepted no longer felt acceptable. The conversations they once avoided suddenly needed answers. The compromises they once made started feeling like pieces of themselves being left behind. Yet almost no one saw the transformation happening because your soulmate did not announce it. They simply began becoming someone new in silence. And this is where you enter the story in a way you may not expect. You were not necessarily the cause of that transformation. You were something more mysterious. You became proof of it. When your soulmate encountered your energy, your character, your way of seeing people, or simply the possibility that a connection could feel different, something inside them recognized how far they had already traveled. That recognition was powerful. It did not necessarily happen all at once. It may have arrived in small moments. A conversation that stayed in their thoughts longer than expected, a kindness they were not used to receiving, a calmness that felt unfamiliar, a strange sense of being understood without having to explain every wound. And their ex, somewhere in the background of this emotional history, began to realize that the version of your soulmate they remembered no longer existed. Do not skip what comes next, because this is the point where the hidden detail begins taking shape. The ex may have assumed that your soulmate would eventually compare you to the past and decide that familiarity was stronger than possibility. But the opposite happened. Your soulmate began comparing the past to what they were learning about themselves now. That difference matters. They were not necessarily choosing one person against another. They were choosing one version of themselves over another. They were asking questions they had avoided for a long time. Who am I when I am not trying to keep everyone comfortable? What kind of love allows me to remain myself? What does it feel like to be valued without constantly proving my worth? Why did I once confuse emotional intensity with emotional depth? Why did I accept uncertainty when my heart was quietly asking for peace? Those questions changed everything. And here is the part: the past would rather remain misunderstood. Your soulmate's ex may have once believed that your soulmate left because they stopped caring. But the truth was more complicated. Your soulmate began stepping away because they finally started caring about their own emotional clarity. There is a difference. Sometimes people leave a chapter not because every feeling disappears, but because they recognize that feelings alone cannot build the future they need. Affection without trust becomes exhaustion. History without growth becomes repetition. Familiarity without understanding becomes a room that feels smaller every year. Your soulmate may have learned this the difficult way. And once they learned it, they could never completely unlearn it. Something extraordinary is hidden inside that realization, my child, and I want you to stay with me long enough to hear it. Your soulmate did not simply walk away from an old relationship. They walked away from an old pattern. That is what the ex may never have fully understood. The visible ending was between two people, but the invisible ending was between your soulmate and the person they used to be. The one who over-explained. The one who waited too long for clarity. The one who accepted mixed signals because they were afraid that asking for certainty might push someone away. The one who mistook patience for endless tolerance. Slowly, your soulmate began to recognize that love should not require the disappearance of the self. And then something happened that the ex did not expect. Your soulmate started speaking about the future differently. Not loudly. Not publicly. Not dramatically. But differently. Friends may have noticed it in passing. Family may have heard a sentence that sounded unusually certain. There may have been a moment when someone casually asked your soulmate what they wanted from love now, and instead of avoiding the question, they answered with surprising clarity. They wanted peace. They wanted loyalty that did not need constant testing. They wanted someone they could grow beside rather than someone they had to continually recover from. They wanted a relationship where silence was comfortable instead of punishing, where vulnerability was not used as leverage, where affection was not offered and withdrawn to create uncertainty. And when your soulmate described those things, there was something they did not say aloud. The qualities they were describing had begun reminding them of you. Stay till the end of this part, because that is not yet the biggest revelation. In fact, it is only the beginning. The ex eventually sensed that something had shifted. Maybe they noticed your soulmate stopped responding in the same emotional way. Maybe an old memory that once had power over them suddenly became only a memory. Maybe the ex tried to revisit something from the past and discovered that the emotional door no longer opened as easily. There was no dramatic battle. No grand scene. Sometimes the strongest closure happens quietly. A person realizes they no longer need the explanation they spent months wishing for. They no longer need the apology to heal. They no longer need the past to admit what happened in order to move toward the future. But there was one thing that still remained unresolved, and this is why the past has not completely disappeared from this story. Your soulmate's ex knew something about your soulmate's feelings that you may never have been told. Something said during the final stage of that old relationship. Something your soulmate admitted at a moment when they were emotionally exhausted and no longer trying to protect appearances. It was not your name. It may even have happened before you became important to them. Yet those words predicted exactly why someone like you would eventually matter so much. Listen carefully. Your soulmate once admitted that what frightened them most was not losing a relationship. What frightened them most was reaching the future and realizing they had spent years inside a connection where they were never fully known. That confession stayed with the ex. And now you can understand why your presence became significant. You did not need to be perfect. You did not need to rescue your soulmate. You did not need to prove yourself every second. Something about the way you entered their emotional world made them feel seen in a place where they had once felt invisible. Maybe it was the way you listened. Maybe you remembered something small they mentioned only once. Maybe your honesty unsettled them because they were accustomed to people saying what was convenient. Maybe there was an unusual softness in the way you treated their uncertainty. Whatever it was, your soulmate recognized something they had asked for long before meeting you, the possibility of being known without performing. Do you understand why this matters? The ex did. Perhaps not immediately, but eventually. And that is when another layer of the hidden story began. There may have been a conversation between your soulmate and their ex after you had already become emotionally significant. It may have been brief. It may have happened indirectly. It may have been disguised as ordinary closure. But beneath the surface, the ex was searching for an answer. They wanted to know whether your soulmate had truly changed or whether this new connection was temporary. They may have asked questions that sounded casual while carrying deeper meaning. Are you happy? Is this serious? Do they really understand you? Are you sure you're not moving too quickly? The words themselves were not necessarily remarkable. What mattered was your soulmate's response. Your soulmate did not defend you with exaggerated promises. They did something far more revealing. They became calm. That calmness said more than excitement ever could. In the old chapter, your soulmate may have spent countless hours explaining their feelings, defending their choices, trying to convince someone to understand them. But when the subject turned toward you, something had changed. They did not feel the same need to prove what they felt. They simply knew that whatever was growing deserved protection from unnecessary interference. That quiet certainty unsettled the ex because it revealed something unmistakable. Your soulmate was no longer emotionally available to the old dynamic. And there is more. The ex may have realized your soulmate had told you things they once struggled to tell anyone. Not necessarily secrets, but truths, fears, dreams, regrets. The private parts of themselves that only appear when trust begins to deepen. Maybe your soulmate mentioned a childhood ambition they had stopped talking about. Maybe they admitted the kind of future they secretly hoped to build. Maybe they told you about an insecurity they normally hid behind humor or confidence. None of these details seem dramatic alone. Together, however, they formed a pattern. Your soulmate was opening. The ex remembered how difficult that once was. And suddenly, the meaning of your connection became impossible to dismiss. Something huge is waiting just beyond this moment, because the greatest hidden truth is not about jealousy. It is not about competition. It is not even about who loved whom more. The real revelation is about timing. Your soulmate's previous relationship may have unknowingly prepared them to recognize something they would have overlooked years earlier. Pain taught discernment. Confusion taught them to value clarity. Emotional inconsistency taught them to notice stability. Being misunderstood taught them to treasure genuine curiosity. And when you appeared, they were finally capable of recognizing qualities they might once have taken for granted. That is why your soulmate sometimes seems surprised by their own feelings toward you. You may have wondered why they occasionally become quiet after a meaningful moment. Why they pull back for a second when things feel especially real. Why something simple between you can affect them more deeply than dramatic gestures ever did. It may be because your soulmate is experiencing a contrast they cannot easily explain. They are noticing how different it feels when connection does not require constant emotional survival. They are discovering that peace can be powerful. They are learning that love does not always enter like thunder. Sometimes it enters like finally putting down a weight you forgot you were carrying. Do not leave yet, because another piece is about to fall into place. There was possibly one moment when the ex directly or indirectly asked what made you different. That question may have stayed unanswered outwardly. Your soulmate might have changed the subject. They might have laughed it away. They might have said, "It's complicated." But inside, the answer was already forming. You made them feel that the future did not have to resemble the past. That was the difference. And once that realization arrived, your soulmate could no longer look backward in the same way. But the ex knew something else, something your soulmate may not realize was remembered. During one of the final honest conversations from the old chapter, your soulmate described the kind of person they hoped they would someday meet. They did not describe appearance. They did not describe status. They did not describe perfection. They described a feeling. They said they wanted someone whose presence felt like they did not have to keep guessing. Someone who could challenge them without humiliating them. Someone who could be strong without becoming cold. Someone whose affection felt sincere rather than strategic. Someone who would inspire them to become more honest with themselves. And now the uncomfortable truth for the past is this: those words began resembling you. Maybe not perfectly. No human connection is perfect. But enough that your soulmate noticed. Enough that the ex noticed too. This is where the story becomes more mysterious, because sometimes another person recognizes what is happening before the people inside the new connection fully admit it. The ex may have seen your soulmate becoming more thoughtful, more grounded, more intentional. Maybe their decisions changed. Maybe they started talking about goals they had postponed. Maybe they became more protective of their time. Maybe they stopped returning to arguments that once consumed them. And while everyone else saw ordinary personal growth, the ex understood the deeper significance because they knew what your soulmate had once said they were searching for. They were becoming ready for the kind of connection they once thought might not exist. And your presence coincided with that awakening. My child, do not mistake this message as a promise that every unanswered question in love has a predetermined supernatural explanation. This is a fictional spiritual story meant to reflect something deeply human. Sometimes the reason a new connection feels powerful is not because the past was meaningless, but because the past taught someone what they can no longer ignore. Your soulmate's history does not need to compete with you. Its greatest purpose may simply be that it taught them how to recognize what deserves to be protected when it finally appears. Yet one final detail remains. And this is the detail the ex may have hoped you would never discover. At some point, after recognizing that your soulmate had changed, the ex may have said something unexpected. Not directly to you. Perhaps not even directly to your soulmate. It could have been spoken to a mutual friend, a relative, or someone who knew enough of the history to understand. The ex admitted that they had seen your soulmate emotionally invested before. They had seen attraction. They had seen attachment. They had seen excitement. But they had never seen your soulmate become this afraid of losing something meaningful. That sentence changes the entire picture. Because your soulmate's occasional hesitation around you may not mean what you thought it meant. You may have interpreted silence as distance. You may have interpreted caution as uncertainty. You may have wondered whether they cared enough because they did not always express themselves in the dramatic way you expected. But sometimes a person becomes cautious precisely because something matters. After disappointment, the heart does not always rush toward what it wants most. Sometimes it approaches slowly, testing whether the ground is real. Your soulmate may be doing exactly that. They are not only asking, "Do I want this?" They are asking, "Can I trust something this important?" And the ex recognized that question before you did. Stay with this, because the deepest revelation is coming closer now. The ex did not necessarily hope you remained unaware because they wanted to destroy your connection. The reason may be far more human. If you discovered how differently your soulmate speaks about you, you might understand that the old chapter no longer has the power it once had. And that truth forces the past to accept its finality. There is grief in finality, even when people know a relationship was not meant to continue. There is something humbling about realizing that someone once struggled to imagine life without you and now dreams about a future that no longer includes you. The ex may have been protecting themselves from that realization. But your soulmate was moving forward whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Then came the moment no one expected. Someone close to your soulmate asked a question about you. It sounded innocent. Almost too ordinary to matter. They asked, "What is it about this person that has changed you so much?" Your soulmate went quiet. Not because they lacked an answer. Because they had too many. They thought about the conversations no one knew about. They thought about the moment you made them feel understood without demanding an explanation. They thought about a sentence you probably forgot saying. They thought about the strange peace that sometimes appears after speaking with you. They thought about the part of themselves that had started imagining possibilities again after years of protecting themselves from disappointment. And then your soulmate said something that traveled farther than they expected. Something the ex eventually heard. Something that changed the way the ex understood your place in this story. Your soulmate said, "They make me want to stop running from the life I actually want." Those words mattered. Because the ex remembered something from years earlier. Something your soulmate had once confessed during one of their most vulnerable conversations. Your soulmate had said, "I'm afraid I'll recognize the right person one day, but I'll be too guarded to let them close." And suddenly, the ex understood. Your soulmate was not afraid that you were the wrong person. They were afraid of repeating an old mistake with someone who might actually be right for the next chapter. That realization created a silence no one could easily break. But there is still one missing piece, and this is where part 1 must leave you, because the next revelation changes everything you have just heard. The ex knew about one conversation your soulmate never told you happened. It took place after your name had already become important. Your soulmate was asked a direct question about what they would do if they were forced to choose between staying emotionally attached to the comfort of their past and risking everything on an uncertain future. Their answer came immediately. But that was not the shocking part. The shocking part was what your soulmate said immediately afterward, when they believed no one else would ever hear it. And when the ex discovered those exact words, they finally understood why your connection had become impossible to ignore.